Hello, freedom loving people, and welcome to another episode of the Restricted Handling Podcast. It's just Ryan and Glenn today. No guests, but we do have some fantastic guests coming up. Glenn's just back from a pretty big trip, which we'll talk through on Serbia. There's a lot going on in the world. We're just coming out of some really significant speeches in Davos. In particular, President Trump put on a show, talked about Greenland, France, Canada, host of other topics. China was fairly quiet, I would say, at Davos, which was interesting. But Greenland seems to be front and center these days. We also wanted to chat about the passing of Aldrich Ames, which I thought I'd get your take on in a little bit. Glenn, welcome back stateside.
Hey, Ryan. How are you?
Great.
How's everything out on the West Coast?
It's good. It's sunny. It's warm, but getting ready for a trip over to Europe soon. So
Nice.
going over to the cold.
Well, we talk about geopolitical events. Washington is getting ready for a big snowstorm.
That's right.
Which usually when we have that happen, like there's no snow at all. And all the kids are depressed because they have to go to school on Monday. They were all dreaming. Remember when we were kids dreaming of like the school being closed? But
Oh, yeah.
yeah, what were we talking about? Anyway, yeah, crazy, a lot of stuff going on. Very active week. President was in Davos. A lot of the other world leaders. It's interesting you mentioned like the Chinese being relatively quiet. I think this is their plan now to present themselves as the acceptable, sane people. You know, the president's speech got a lot of attention. Greenland, of course, has gotten a lot of attention. Not a topic that, I think I said in one of these podcasts, imagine you were the one analyst doing Greenland in the intelligence community, and then President Trump came to office, and all of a sudden this topic became very big. So you're pretty busy and pretty popular.
That's right.
And
That's right.
you're in demand. But as I've tried to remind some people, there were a lot of warnings about security in the Arctic and the growing threat in the Arctic. And I would say that a lot of people just ignored it. And so the president has made this a huge issue from the time he came into office. And it's very interesting to see like what will happen now. I was glad that he said in Davos, we're not going to take it by force, because I don't think most Americans want to go to war with Europe over Greenland. And hopefully that will calm things down within the NATO alliance and with our European allies, because they are allies. But it's also spurred some of those European countries to deploy troops and take some steps which they were not taking before. And so maybe there's a method to the madness. I don't know.
I think if that's the goal, it's working. Like they're spending more, they're more engaged, if that's the goal. Question for you, Glenn, and I think it's worth pointing out, right? We kind of evolved on Greenland from anything is on the table to, okay, we'll take force off the table. And even purchasing it, I think, has been walked back a little bit. And now it's more in a NATO security guarantee type perspective. In your estimation, how do we get to that? Trump seemed really set on like, I'm taking this. I feel like somebody walked him back. Any thoughts on that?
Well, one, I mean, there's one theory is he never really planned to use force to take it back. In fact,
Just the art of the deal.
yeah, I mean, kind of maximalist demands, get attention, rattle the tree, because again, some people would argue, and I'm one of them, that, our European allies kind of just kept putting this off and, talk to the hand. During the first Trump administration, President Trump warned the Europeans on a number of issues, including stop doing business with Russia, stop doing business with China if you want us to help defend Europe from those threats. And many of our European allies, not all of them, but many of them, ignored that. And they continue to do business. And the Greenland issue, there were experts, specialists that were focused on the Arctic, and they were saying this is becoming a serious security threat for NATO and for the United States and members of the alliance. And I'm not sure much was done. And so some people are saying, they were saying throughout this whole mini crisis in the last week or 10 days, whatever it was, that the United States, by agreements that we have, we can deploy more troops and we can do pretty much whatever we want militarily on Greenland. But I've tried to make the point, I don't know necessarily the president wants the United States to do it. I think there's a sense here among people in the this administration, that the United States can't keep doing it, right? Other members of NATO need to do it. And so if that was what he was thinking, and I'm not saying I know, because I have no special insight, but he got a reaction. Now, what the cost will be, right? The frayed relations might, would it be worth it? I don't know. But hopefully our alliance is deep enough that we can go through these. And by the way, the NATO alliance has gone through other crises as well. The French left, came back in. We have Turkey and Greece, members of the alliance, which are, we've had very difficult relations over the years. The Greeks left, they came back in. NATO expansion sometimes has been contentious. We saw with Sweden and Finland. Some countries in the alliance were against that initially. They had objections, and we worked it. We worked it out, and we went through it, and it got done. So I'm hopeful that the European Atlantic Alliance will not deteriorate. And I think probably the most upset person in Davos yesterday when Trump gave his speech was Kirill Dmitriev, who was egging on social media, egging on basically an end of the transatlantic alliance. I think the Russians are dreaming of that.
Oh my gosh. 4 years ago, could they have said, like, the thing that's going to end the NATO alliance is going to be a fight over Greenland?
Yeah, no, I doubt that any analyst in the Kremlin or in the Russian, like the SVR or the GRU, made that assessment.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's more likely that this whole episode has shown them again how unpredictable the president is, which may not be a bad thing.
I got to imagine they probably still are ramping up their operations to just somehow convince people to keep going at it over Greenland. Now, you made the point, maybe the play here is to get other countries to step up and put boots on the ground in Greenland as opposed to us. But it seems like we wanted Greenland for ourselves. You're thinking maybe it was just a ploy to get other people there? I thought he really did want it, the sovereign aspect of it.
I think maybe there's an element of this is just a tactic used to get more attention. I don't know.
Interesting.
Now, we have offered to buy Greenland in the past. It has been a topic of discussion or offers made. By the way, I don't know if I can do this on air, but if anybody watches Conan Without Borders, you should watch the episode when he goes to Greenland during the first Trump administration when Trump offered to buy it. It's a pretty funny episode.
You haven't been to Greenland, have you?
Never. I've flown over it a few times. In fact, I was just flew over 2 nights ago, and I can tell all our viewers there was no military action going on.
That's what everybody tuned in for.
A couple of disturbed puffins, I think, but yeah, maybe some walruses.
Have you done Iceland?
No, I have not. Have you?
Yes.
Really?
A couple times.
Worth it?
That is one you got to do.
I've heard that. Yeah, that's on the bucket list.
Okay. Just before we move off of Greenland here, we had talked before about these poly markets. There's one that's called Kalshi. And there is a bet on will the U.S. take control of any part of Greenland before 2027. And that's like any sovereign territory. So if we have a base that's considered sovereign, not leased base, but just a sovereign U.S.-owned part of the island. What do you think the percentages of people who think that will happen before 2027? And what do you think?
I think the percentage is probably 65%.
That it will happen?
Yeah.
Yeah, right now it's 25%.
Oh, 25%. Okay.
I know.
Do I think no, I don't think we're going to seize territory from Greenland, from Denmark.
You don't think we'll get sovereign territory?
No, because there's a danger. Because let's say that we take territory, we force the Danes to give up some of Greenland, then they'll cut off our access to those really good sugar cookies, and then those tins that everyone uses for their sewing kits. That could cause a crisis across the United States. A lot of grandmothers would be very upset.
But I'm sure the tariffs are already so high on those anyway, Glenn, that you're not getting them.
So, I think he rolled back the tariff threat.
Okay.
Yes.
I actually think we will. I think we're going to have a sovereign piece of Greenland. That's going to be my prediction. And I'm kind of mad we didn't bet on this at our year-end review.
You got the last one right, so
we'll see. And on that point, so Iran seems to be fizzling out, sadly. I don't know if you have a different perspective, Glenn, but I think we're past the point where we were hoping to see maybe a more significant change. You've still got blackouts and internet shutouts in the country, so it's hard to know what's going on. But from what we can glean, it doesn't seem like we're looking at regime change right now.
All
Any
right.
thoughts on your end? Too early to call?
I think it's too early. What I read in the paper yesterday is that we're moving some more assets into the region, which would indicate that we're preparing, getting ourselves in a better position. That's number one. Number two, I don't think that this protest movement is over, or the complete dissatisfaction with the regime is over. I said in our podcast with our wonderful guest, Imad, we've got to support the Iranian people who had the courage to go out to the streets. The numbers are amazing. I mean, not amazing. It's horrible how many people were slaughtered by the regime so they could hold on to power. But I don't think that's going to stop the Iranian people at this point from demanding a change. So it may take a couple more months, but I think it's going to happen this year. I predicted that, and I think there's going to be regime change in Iran. And hopefully it comes internally from the people of Iran. There are some things that maybe we and other countries can do to support them. And of course, we should absolutely be ready to take advantage of the opportunity in the best possible way when they demand their or they take their freedom back from that regime to help them economically and help them, rebuild their country, which is going to need a lot of help.
For those who didn't catch that interview with Imad Shargi, one of the things that I've thought about a few times now, so he was, for people who didn't catch it, he was a prisoner of the IRGC for, I think, 5 years, not too long ago. And he said the worst part of every day, and he had stories of being interrogated for like 8 or 9 hours at a time. He said the worst part of every day was listening to their propaganda blasted at night over and over and over again. And I had never really considered that. When we did our training on captivity in the Army, at least, they blare that stuff, but it's this fake country. It's really hard to appreciate. But when you hear him say it after 5 years inside, that was pretty special.
Yeah, I agree. So you think we're going to take by force? You think we're going to buy?
No.
What is in terms of Greenland like?
In Greenland, I think what's going to happen is we're going to reach an agreement where we are allowed to have bases that are considered sovereign U.S. territory.
Okay.
I mean, there's been talk about it today already. So this is not like a novel idea for me, but I think we came in maximalist, like we'll take it by force, we'll pay, like maybe we'll buy it.
Right.
Since we've walked those back, we could already put bases there. So that's already the status quo. I think the next step up is some sovereign land, but I can't quite understand why we would want that unless it's for a longer play.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the White House thinks that this is a very strategic area now. So I am by no means an expert on the Arctic. In fact, I hate any weather below 65 degrees. Like that's horrible for me at this stage of my life. But by the way, we're talking about Davos. We're talking about Davos, and obviously the president's speech got a lot of attention, and there's a lot of back and forth and angst among people. I'm on about like 20 group chats of different former colleagues, people I do business with, and there's all kinds of stuff going back and forth. But one of the things was missed really by most of the world is that the prime minister of Armenia and the president of Azerbaijan were together at Davos. They sat together, like just another reminder that there are some very positive things happening in the world in terms of, potential peace and actually peace in the South Caucasus right now and the potential for longer term peace.
I want to talk about your trip to Serbia.
Mm-hmm.
Can you run us through why'd you go over there? I assume this is part of the consulting.
Doing consulting for a company there and great company. It's doing a lot of very interesting stuff. I got to visit a movie studio, which was awesome. There's a great studio in just outside of Belgrade that this company owns, and we got a great tour of the studio, and it's really impressive. They built like a
local stuff.
What's that?
They make local shows, or
they make local shows, but they're open for business. They're looking for U.S. companies to come and documentaries or TV series. I won't name some of the companies that they're looking to engage with on the podcast, but big names in the U.S. So they're actually, the government of Serbia is offering very good subsidies and conditions for foreign companies to come make films in Serbia. And it seems like a pretty state-of-the-art facility they built. They have an outdoor area. They recreated like an old Soviet town, which was kind of eerie to be in.
Interesting.
And just seems like a great staff. Like, apparently, Belgrade was the center of the Yugoslav film industry in the past. So there's a tradition of filmmaking. Balkans. And then, it's very interesting. I'd never been to Serbia before. I've had a lot of Serbian friends over the years, and this was a great opportunity to go see a country that I wanted to see. The Ministry of Defense that we bombed in 1999 during the NATO operation there, during the Milosevic years, is still burnt, bombed out, sitting empty. Serbia itself, and by the way, we're going to have a guest on the next podcast to talk about this, former U.S. ambassador to Serbia. So he'll do a much better job of talking about some of the nuances and complications of the governance in Serbia and regional politics. The people of Serbia are kind of caught between East and West, Russia and NATO, the European Union, the U.S., and it's really like very interesting country and very interesting dynamic and great food. Great food.
Okay.
I went into a restaurant. I ordered they have this thing. It's like the Balkans in Germany. It's like the Grillteller. I don't know if you remember when you lived here. But I ordered, as I said, in Serbian, like the small size. So I ordered the small meat plate, and it was like stacked like this.
Is that the picture you sent me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It was pretty good.
Hey, how come they left the Ministry of Defense repaired?
Oh, interesting story. Without going into great detail, there was a plan by some Americans connected with the Trump administration to invest and rebuild that facility and build it into a mall, like not a mall, like a business center. And I think they had all the financing lined up and everything. And then somebody started a media campaign to undermine that. And it basically, there was articles written in U.S. Western papers, Serbian papers that were attacking the idea and appealing to the more nationalist Serbians. This is a national landmark, and how can we let Americans, rebuild it after what they did? And whoever was behind this, and I think there's suspicion that the Russians were behind it, they killed the project. And it's kind of sad because my understanding was it would have been pretty good for people of Belgrade. So
Yeah, you sent me a picture of it. I mean, looks like it was hit by a missile.
it was, yeah, completely destroyed.
All right, let's stay on the topic of Russia then with this. Aldrich Ames passed away in early January of this year. And I would be super interested to get your take just for background for people who don't know him as well, which hopefully you don't, but certainly folks from our background are well versed in what this person did. But former CIA officer for decades who ended up spying for the Russians. So many case studies that came out of this. He was able to successfully spy for almost 10 years, mid 80s to mid 90s, Soviet Union and then Russia. I mean, lots of stories about him having Jaguar that should have raised attention, like his vehicle was not commensurate with the pay that you make at the agency, certainly at the time, the suits he had, why he was recruited. But Glenn, you lived a lot of this. Like, what do you remember about Aldrich Ames?
Well, when in 1994, when he was arrested, there was obviously a lot of angst in the intelligence community and the U.S. government. And at the time, I was working for INSCOM for the Army, and I'll never forget it. There was a lot of angst and a lot of sensitivity and a lot of finger pointing. Who missed this? What went wrong? How can this have happened for so long? I mean, it wasn't pretty. I always found it ironic that at the time we were giving Russia a large amount of money to stay afloat, economic assistance, aid, and like USAID was inside of Russia. U.S. government was providing loans, all kinds of money, and they were using that money to pay one of their top assets. Now, of course, he was recruited. He volunteered, by the way. He volunteered
Yes.
to work for the Soviets during the Soviet period before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he continued even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, I'm not going to go into too much detail on like how that impacted me personally or some of the things that we were doing. But I will say it was a very traumatic experience for a lot of people. He killed a lot of people. He resulted in the execution of a lot of Russians and Soviet citizens. He caused major problems for people who were not guilty of anything. There's some horrific stories about him getting it wrong and telling his handlers that somebody was working for the Americans when they weren't. And unfortunately, he wasn't alone. I mean, there were some other very serious cases, the Hansen case, FBI senior special agent, Nicholson case. So there was a whole litany. And one of the other things is ironic in my assessment in the late 80s, or let's say the 80s and 90s, our program against the Soviet Union was very effective. There's a great book everybody should read. It could read. It's called, I think it's called Spy Handler. It's written by a guy by the name of Victor Cherkashin. He was a KGB officer, then an SVR officer. He served multiple times in Washington, and he handled Ames. And he handled
Wow.
the Hansen case and the Walker case. And I always encourage people to read that book because he handled some of the biggest espionage cases that the Soviets had and the Russians had. But he also, when he went back to Moscow at the end of his career, he was kind of pushed aside. And he didn't get a lot of credit for what he thought he did. If you read his book, he kind of talks about this. And my understanding is the reason was because the KGB leadership and then the SVR leadership did not want people to know how badly they had been penetrated by the U.S. intelligence community. And I'll take a moment to say that at that period, when I came into the intelligence community and in the late 80s, we had some really great officers that had really learned the art of espionage and how to run cases. And later on in my career, I got to work with some of them, work for some of them, and learn from them. They were great mentors. They were great, great people. we'll try and get at least one of them on the program who was like a master, like when it comes to espionage, like classic, just, espionage cases. Spy handler and he was my boss at one point overseas, just great guy, great leader. And, they just, we knew the business really well. So it was, to be part of that was, on the one hand, I was very proud or like honored to work with those people. On the other hand, many of them were personally impacted by what Hansen did and burned by what he did. And there's nothing worse, I will say, this is what I learned in my career. There's nothing worse than betrayal. To have one of your colleagues betray you, right? Someone betray you. There's nothing worse in my career. Everything else I went through, and you go through a lot, nothing was more painful than the idea that somebody that worked with you, that you may have been friends with, you may have eaten with in the cafeteria, you may have hung out with on the weekends, betrayed you and the values that, we were supposed to be protecting.
I have no inside knowledge of him and what he did. So everything I'm about to say is just from, open source, but looks like he was responsible for at least 10 deaths of very high profile Russian cases, Soviet cases, who'd been working with us for years. He had several overseas tours, looks like a few places around the globe, not great personnel reviews. Like, he wasn't the greatest officer. His father was also somewhat of a not great officer as well. Drinking problem. He had a wife with really expensive tastes. He was really in it for money, is what it came down to in the end. And you said he volunteered. I mean, it sounds like he walked into the Soviet embassy in DC and was carrying bags of information with him and getting paid thousands of dollars, which amounted to a lot at that time.
Yeah.
And he spent it.
Yes, he did. And, like when people say he was a bad officer, I don't know. I never worked with him. And so I don't know. And I always am very hesitant to say someone was a bad officer, a good officer. But if you look at the case, like what his motivations were and why he did what he did, one of it was money. He needed money. He wanted money. Part of it was pressure, I think, from his second wife. So Rosario was the second wife.
Yeah.
I think she had, fine taste. She wanted nice stuff. It's interesting if you look at the pressure he was probably under in the organization to produce, the pressure to living in Washington, the cost of living, as a government employee. And he, there were a lot of, if he put it like this, I always find this very interesting too. If he was that good of a target, the Russians never found him. The Soviets didn't find him. He went to them, right?
Yep.
So, and if you read Chekarshin's book, it's very interesting because he said, listen, the Americans talk about how bad this guy was, but he was my asset. He was very good. He was a smart guy. He was capable. So it's interesting to see it, put yourself in the other side's shoes, which I always try to do in my career, like try and understand their perspective. But he cost the lives of, like, he killed people. He had blood on his hands. And of course, he betrayed the country, and that's unacceptable. And, people probably get mad at me when I say it, but I feel sorry. Well, I feel sorry for his family. I feel sorry especially sorry for the people that he betrayed.
Yeah. Actually, on that topic, we may have talked about this in the past, and I know you've probably read this like 4 times, Glenn, the Sword in the
Every
Shield.
American should read that.
So I just started. So for people who aren't watching, you're just listening. This is The Sword and the Shield, the Matrokin Archive, and the Secret History of the KGB. The reason I'm bringing this up, it's a massive book for people who can't see it. And I'm sure you know it inside and out, Glenn. But this is a KGB officer who worked in their archives and brought all this information out. A new book in the last few months just came out called The Spy in the Archive, which is about Matrokin. So I just started reading it. Fascinating book. And I'll put The Spy Handler on next when I get done with this one. I hadn't heard of that yet. But for people who do enjoy this, like, I would recommend this book. It's very well written. I'm probably 10% in, but it's really good.
In the case of Matrokin, what's interesting for our viewers, those of you that have employees, think about this. Matrokin was kind of mistreated by his leadership in the KGB. He decided one of the avenues to getting somebody to betray their country or their organization is vengeance. He was angry about the way they was treated, and they assigned him to a job in the archives of the KGB, which was like the lowliest of low jobs. He had been an operations officer. So once they made him an archivist, he was never going overseas again. There was no glory. You were no longer the fighter pilot, right? And so to get revenge, he started copying all the files on notes and putting them in his socks and his underwear. And he'd walk out of KGB headquarters every day, and he'd go and he'd bury them at his dacha on the weekends. And it's a fascinating story. Some of the stuff in the Matrokin archives that he talks about, which was later confirmed by other like sources, is really, really fascinating. For example, most Americans probably do not know that the Soviets were burying weapons caches around the United States in the event of a war, near dams, near bridges, right? He talks about the units that were responsible for targeting, like creating sabotage in the United States. Of course, he talks about some of the famous espionage cases that the Russians were running, the Soviets were running. I mean, we go on for hours about this, but he, fascinating guy. And I heard they're making a movie about him, which I think would be
Interesting.
great.
Oh,
But my main point here is, sometimes we do, public speaking leadership discussions with companies. And I always tell them, like, they always ask, how do you, like, insider threat? What do you do about insider threat? One of the things you do is you treat your people well,
yeah.
right? And
Yep.
don't be abusive.
Yeah. Actually, the book starts out, this new book, The Spy in the Archive, with him in Western Europe trying to get into an embassy of somebody who will trust him to take this info, and how he's dismissed outright a few times. And I mean, it's when you know what's in this archive and in the files, it's like, oh my gosh, the treasure trove, and somebody finally believes him. Okay. Quickly, want to jump to the UK, where I think in Davos, the UK announced that they are going to allow China to build their behemoth embassy in downtown London. Want to get your reactions, Glenn. Thoughts here?
Why? No. My understanding is that the head of MI5 came out and said that, that they've assessed that they can manage the security threats, but there's no guarantee, something like this.
Yeah.
Right. I think this kind of news, when it comes out, this is the stuff that gets certain people in the United States riled up. And they say, okay, are we in this together or we're not in this together? Why, why would you allow the Chinese? If you remember last summer, one of our NATO partners, my understanding is, if I remember correctly, they signed a very large telecommunications deal for their Ministry of Defense with, I believe, Huawei or ZTE, right? What? Like, why? Now, it's the United Kingdom is a sovereign country, and apparently they did all the assessments and they think they can manage the problem. Although, what I read in the media is that this facility is right next to a number of communications cables and, important, but
yeah. I'm going to take us
the British have much more experience with espionage than we do and counter-espionage.
You're saying that in a positive way?
No, they do.
Okay.
They were considered the masters, by the way, for many, many years. So maybe they got this under control. I hope so.
I don't know if it's a spicy take on my side. I am not that apprehensive here of them doing it. Like, I would agree that it's probably a manageable risk. Is it great? No. But I would assume, like many places, they're making this because they're deciding on this because it's some type of commercial incentive or business deal on the back end. It opens doors for them with China. And I feel like right now, countries are really pushing for almost every person for themselves right now. So if this gives them maybe a more gracious foothold with China, I guess you give it away. And you just have a whole lot of surveillance posted around that place and listening devices. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, again, we used to have a saying, there are no allies, right? There may be temporary partners and stuff, but the British have to do what the British think is good for the United Kingdom. And they should remember the United States can always have to do what's good for the United States. Now, and it's always been like that. Like, there's never been a period, in my opinion, where everybody just pulled together. There have been I shouldn't say that, there have been a couple of times when for short periods, people were all pulling the sled together, but then it starts to fracture and fray. And I saw the Russians were very good at like driving wedges, like peeling people off from the pack. The Chinese are doing it with economic incentives. The Russians would do it by offering all kinds of, gas and oil deals, special rights, special access to the market. So,
Yeah.
right.
Speaking of oil and gas, the EU just passed another sanctions package, or closing a loophole that allows other countries to refine crude and resell it to Europe from Russia, which should really further decrease the amount of revenue they can bring in from their oil and gas business, which is a great thing also.
Yeah. Listen, your talk about Russia, my understanding is Steve Witkoff is either there now or he's on his way with Kushner. And Witkoff told the media that the Russians asked for this meeting. So there is some speculation that the Russians are going to, or I mean, there's no doubt they're going to respond to the peace proposal that has been worked on by the U.S., the Europeans, and the Ukrainians for a couple of months now. So we may have some very interesting news coming in the next couple of days.
My understanding is they're really focusing on territory. Like that's before they get to some of the other lower hanging fruit. It's like, we got to solve this now, is who gets what terrain.
Okay, you heard me say this before, but I'm going to say it again. President Trump has invited Putin to join the peace board for Gaza. And my understanding is Putin came back and he understood it as being a peace, but different spelling board, because he wants a piece of Ukraine. He wants a piece of the Baltics. That's a bad joke going back to my childhood in the 70s in the Cold War. I remember my uncle saying that. He said, the Soviet Union only wants peace, a piece of Europe, a piece
I've never heard that one.
Africa. Yeah.
All right.
Sorry, viewers.
Nope. That's what we're doing.
But we'll see. I mean, I think the Ukrainians have, there were meetings in Davos with Witkoff and Umarov, the head of the National Security Council of Ukraine. And the Ukrainians have shown a lot of, they've been shown a lot of flexibility on what they're willing to consider to try and get this war to come to an end. Now the ball's in the Russians' court. Let's see. They have, because their economy is in the dumps, and it's only getting
dumps.
It's only getting worse.
It's only getting worse. And then on the other side for Ukraine, you had Secretary General of NATO calling at Davos for like, hey, if you have interceptors or some capability for Ukraine, you other, NATO allies, turn over every stone and find it, because they're running low, trying to defend against these hundreds of missiles and barrages of drones that come over every night. And so both sides are bleeding right now.
Both sides are bleeding. I think I said this in one of our earlier podcasts. One Ukrainian politician said to me, this is like a boxing match. Like, you have to remember when you're really tired and you're like aching, that your opponent is also really tired and aching. Who can last to the 15th round? Who can stay on their feet to the 15th round? It's terrible that we're in this situation, but the Russians created this mess, and we got to get Ukraine, in my opinion, they've got to get through this winter, because the Russians are trying to terrorize them. I spoke to friends of mine in Kiev yesterday. It was, I think, minus 15, and half the city's without electricity. But what the person said is the weather's getting better, and we're going to survive this. We're going to get through it. So the resilience is pretty impressive.
Glenn, what do you think that we'll get out of here in a minute? I know you got to get your workout in. I don't want to stop you. But we talked about the Matrokin files and some of the information about pre-positioning weapons in the U.S. What do you think Russia's doing in Ukraine right now in some of the contested territory that maybe they don't have? Or what might they be doing to set the groundwork for once peace is established,
right,
for their own operations?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that we're going to have peace. We'll probably have a ceasefire, right, and an end to the conventional warfare that we've been seeing. But the active measures, some people call the gray zone warfare, will continue, no doubt about it. The Russians were doing it going back to 1991 in Ukraine to try and control and influence the direction of the country and its politics. The difference now, Ryan, is that the Ukrainians have demonstrated they have the ability to do the same thing to the Russians, sometimes in droves, right? So maybe that'll be a deterrent from the Russians for being too aggressive in the future, whether it's in the cyberspace, lethal operations, assassinations, sabotage. But both sides, I'm sure, are preparing for what would be the next stage of the conflict.
Yeah.
Right? So that's one. Two, I'll just kind of reverse the question a little bit. The Russians have to think about, they have got those occupied territories. They're going to have to contend with, they have to contend with it now, a large number of people who don't want them there. Right? And that's going to be very hard to control. Like the chance for guerrilla warfare or subterfuge, gray zone activities for the Ukrainians against Russian occupation forces are going to be pretty high. And again, the Ukrainians have demonstrated they're very capable. They're not the opponent that the Russians faced in 2014 when they occupied Crimea and they started the war in the Donbass. So
it's going to be a rude awakening for, I don't even know if it's gray zone tactics, if it's insurgency, what it'll be. Sometime we'll put this on pause. Ramzan Kadyrov, like being sick, Chechen leader, I would love to get more on him and what that, like your experience there, Glenn, what you understand of him and the relationship with Russia and what it means for him to possibly pass on who comes next, et cetera.
I have a friend here in the DC area, he's Chechen American, and I asked him if he'd come on the podcast. Right. I don't know if he will do it or not. He's a little hesitant. One thing I will tell our viewers is that I was stopped many times, and when I was in Russia, in the former Soviet Union, people thought I was Chechen. So, and I actually had a police officer stop me once. I was driving, a Russian traffic cop, and he came up to the window of the car and he said, "Hey, you look like Ramazan Kadyrov's brother." And I said, "Actually, he's my uncle, and you better leave me alone or you're going to know the consequences." And the guy basically just turned around and walked away because the Russians were afraid of Kadyrov,
Oh,
his guys, and the Chechens. And we could do a whole podcast on, in
yep.
the 90s, organized crime, the first Chechen war, the second Chechen war. Again, most Americans probably don't remember this, but there was a horrific war that the Russians, that started in the 1994. And the Chechens, the Chechen separatists defeated the Russians in the first war, and they pushed the Russians out. And then the Russians went back in when Putin came to power. That was one of his ways of getting power because the Russians had been humiliated, and he promised them vengeance. Yeah, there was an incident in Moscow where 2 apartment buildings were blown up. I forget that maybe 600 people died. And there was a lot of speculation, and to this day, there's a lot of speculation that actually Putin had the FSB blow up those buildings, and then they blamed the Chechens as an excuse
Yeah.
to restart the war.
Okay.
And there was a statement today I read in the paper that talking about Cuba, regime change in Cuba, regime change in Cuba by the end of the year.
This is crazy.
I did have this week one American company tell me they are interested in going into do business in Venezuela, which is kind of interesting. They understand it's risky, but that's how they make their money. They go places where other people won't go. And then shifting gears, we should also mention that last week there was also a kind of a ceasefire between the SDF, YPG, and the government in Syria. So this is the Kurdish issue. And my understanding is it's a very fragile agreement to stop the fighting in the Kurdish areas because, or predominantly, populated Kurdish areas, because members of the PKK, which is the terrorist organization that has been fighting against the Turkish government, the Turkish state for years, the PKK members of or let's say the members of the SDF that have like immediate, very strong ties with the PKK don't want a ceasefire agreement, and they're trying to destabilize the situation. And in the meantime, the U.S. has had to seize control of some of the prisons in Syria where ISIS members were being detained because there's concern that if the SDF was being used to guard those prisons, if they are no longer guarding the prisons, then someone's going to have to guard them, or else you're going to have a lot of ISIS fighters running around, which I don't think anybody wants. So it's a very interesting situation. We should probably do a whole podcast on that one too.
Yep.
Because, I was just in Istanbul. For the Turks, this is a huge deal. And for the Kurds, it's a huge deal. For the Syrians, it's a huge deal. And some for good things, some to positive development, others not. But it could undermine regional stability for sure.
Yeah. I got a Christmas card this year from a guy who I served in the army with, who was also a pilot. He's a battalion commander now in Syria. It's just a reminder, like I felt really bad, like not even knowing he was over there. Yet another deployment. He's downrange again, is probably his 4th, 5th, maybe 6th. So we still got troops there, like you said, guarding the bases.
We lost,
Yep.
I think 2 soldiers to an ISIS attack. And then the administration, I think there's probably 70 targets struck by the U.S. military in response to that. So, the CT threat is not over by any means.
Maybe the last thing I'll put on people's radar that's going to come up in the next 2 weeks potentially is a snap election in Japan. We don't often talk about Japan, but just because Sanai Takaichi as a leader there is so polarizing with China, you have to imagine China is about to go into overdrive to somehow sort a different leader in Japan during this process. So that's one people should keep an eye on. If it happens, it's a potential snap election. It could happen early February.
Which is very important, right, for the U.S. economy. I mean, the trade ties with Japan, and Japan's a major ally for the United States and Asia and the Pacific region. So, yeah, definitely need to watch that.
All right, Glenn, you go get your workout in, get buff.
What are you doing?
Rest up.
Yeah, I know that buff is not a word that's going to ever be associated with this guy anymore.
What are we doing? My oldest is heading back to college, so we got to get him out the door, and then I'm heading off to Europe for some work trips. I understand it is pretty stinking cold in Europe right now, so it's been a while since I've been in that kind of weather, so I'm getting ready for that.
Well, the Russians have a saying: "There's no such thing as bad weather, only a lack of vodka." In your case, maybe a lack of beer and schnapps. I don't know.
That's right.
So
is that a saying that they have?
Yes, it is.
That's a good one. All
Yes,
right.
it is. So not encouraging people to drink, but stay warm.
That's right.
So listen, have a great trip. Have a safe trip. Europe's beautiful. I mean, you and I both had the opportunity to live there in different countries. I lived in Belgium. My father was stationed there in the army. I lived in Germany. I served in Germany and Bavaria, and it's like paradise.
Yep.
For all our European viewers, I think we had one when we looked. We had at least one person in Hungary.
That's right.
I'm pretty sure I know who it is, but maybe he can get us 2 people in Hungary, and maybe a couple other people in Europe, and we'll grow our followership in Europe. With all the back and forth. I just say this: we have a lot of great friends in Europe, and they are allies. And sometimes allies don't agree on stuff. They don't get along. I have 4 brothers. We fought about a lot of stuff, but I still love them all, and we're still brothers. And if somebody ever threatened one of us, I think the other ones would all come to their aid. I hope so. And you, Ryan, if anyone threatens you, I'm that sword hanging on my shelf. I'm coming to help you.
You're using it? All right. I like it.
I don't think it comes out of the sheath, but that's another story.
That's all right. Blow to the head. All right. Thank you, everybody. Y'all stay safe, and I'll see you next time.
Okay. Ciao.
Thanks for listening and being a part of the RH community. Would you like to receive the same daily intel brief that Glenn and I read? You can get it at restrictedhandling.com. We've curated what we consider to be the most relevant and reputable sources on all things international security, geopolitics, military and intel ops, and economics and sanctions, focused exclusively on Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and the Middle East, to include accompanying podcasts for Russia, China, economics, and spy stories. Just head to restrictedhandling.com, enter your email, and you'll get the daily briefs that Glenn and I both read, and you can leave comments and questions that we can respond to. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe.